Step out of the vehicle now.
Officer, for the third time, what exactly are we being detained for?
I don't need to explain myself to you.
Then you might want to explain it to the FBI.
What did you just say?
It was 9:14 on a warm Thursday night, just outside Oak Ridge, a suburban stretch of road lined with gas stations, dark storefronts, and long patches of empty shoulder where even the silence feels observed. Malcolm and Nia Brooks had just left a dinner celebrating Malcolm's younger sister getting accepted into medical school. It had been one of those good nights, the kind that leaves warmth in your chest on the drive home. Laughter still hanging in the air. Music low. Windows cracked just enough to let the spring air in. Nia was driving because Malcolm had insisted she take his new car out more often. A clean black sedan, perfectly legal tint, current tags, no mechanical issues, no traffic violations. They weren't speeding. They weren't weaving. They hadn't run a light or ignored a sign. They were just driving while black on the wrong road at the wrong time in front of the wrong man. Nia Brooks was 34 years old and not the kind of woman people forgot once they met her. She had the kind of calm that didn't look dramatic from the outside, but had been built over years of discipline, pressure, and quiet refusal to be reduced by anybody. She'd grown up in Baltimore, the oldest of 3 girls, in a house where excellence wasn't treated like a gift. It was treated like survival. Her mother was a public defender. Her father had taught chemistry at a city college for nearly 30 years. They taught their daughters 2 things early. First, never confuse politeness with surrender. Second, know your rights so well that nobody can lie to you about them with a badge on their chest. Nia took that lesson further than anyone expected. She graduated near the top of her class in college, earned a law degree, worked in federal prosecution for several years, and eventually moved into a specialized federal investigative unit where legal precision mattered just as much as field instincts. She knew procedure, chain of custody, constitutional limits, reporting standards, and the 1,000 little ways abuse of authority tries to disguise itself as routine. She had testified in federal court, dismantled false narratives on the record, and helped put violent offenders away without ever raising her voice. She was composed because she had trained herself to be, not because she had never been angry. People always confuse those 2 things. Malcolm Brooks was 36, broader in the shoulders, softer in the eyes, and somehow even harder to rattle than his wife. Before federal work, he'd spent years in military intelligence and later transitioned into interagency operations focused on organized crime and public corruption. He was the kind of man who could read a room in seconds and a threat in even less. Funny at dinner, dead serious when necessary. He understood surveillance, de-escalation, and the psychology of men who perform authority because they're addicted to the feeling of being obeyed. He also understood something else. When you are a black man in America, there are moments when competence doesn't protect you. Sometimes it only surprises the people trying to diminish you. That night, they weren't in tactical gear. They weren't carrying visible credentials around their necks. They were off-duty, dressed like a married couple coming back from family dinner. Nia still had on gold earrings and a navy blouse. Malcolm had loosened his collar and taken off his jacket, turned on the interior lights. She placed both hands on the steering wheel. Malcolm set his hands on his knees where they were clearly visible. They did everything people are told to do. Every rule, every gesture, every precaution. None of it mattered. Officer Daniel Hensley had been on the Oak Ridge police force for 11 years. He was the kind of officer who described himself as old school, which in his case mostly meant he believed respect should be given to him automatically and suspicion should be distributed selectively. He had 2 commendations, several use-of-force complaints that never led anywhere, and a reputation among certain co-workers for not being afraid to get proactive, which is often how departments describe men whose judgment gets people hurt right up until a camera makes the paperwork inconvenient. When Hensley approached the car, the first thing he saw was not a violation. It was a black couple in an expensive vehicle on a road near a wealthy subdivision, and something in his mind filled in the rest with the speed of prejudice. Maybe stolen. Maybe drugs. Maybe attitude. Maybe a chance to remind somebody who was in charge. That calculation happened before the flashlight ever hit the glass. License and registration, he said. Nia answered with textbook composure. Certainly. Can you tell me the reason for the stop before I reach for my bag? That should have been easy. A lawful question. A routine question. A question any professional officer answers without drama. But Hensley heard challenge where there was only caution, and to men like him, A calm black woman asking for justification can sound more offensive than a drunk white man yelling in their face. I'll ask the questions, he said. Malcolm leaned slightly forward, not aggressive, just attentive. Officer, she's informing you before she moves. That's standard. Hensley swung the flashlight back to Malcolm. I wasn't talking to you. No, Malcolm said quietly. You were escalating with her. There are moments when people reveal themselves almost instantly. Hensley could have corrected course right there. He could have explained the reason, kept it clean, and moved on. Instead, his ego chose the steering wheel. Step out of the vehicle, he said to Malcolm. On what basis? Nia asked. Failure to comply. I haven't failed to comply, she replied. I asked why I was stopped before reaching. Hensley took another step back and touched the radio on his shoulder. I've got 2 non-compliant occupants. Send me a second unit. The words landed like a threat because they were meant to. Malcolm looked ahead through the windshield. There it is. Nia exhaled slowly. Officer, we are recording this interaction. He gave a humorless smile. Good. So am I. That line might have sounded strong in his head. It would sound a lot different later. Now, before we go further, think about this for a second. How many bad situations begin because one person with authority decides that being questioned, even politely, is the same thing as being disrespected? That's how small some of these moments start. Not with danger. Not with crime. With ego. Hensley ordered Malcolm out first. Malcolm complied, moving slowly, narrating every motion. Unbuckling. Opening the door. Stepping out. He knew the drill. He also knew Hensley was no longer acting like a cop investigating a traffic violation. He was acting like a man trying to win a personal contest nobody else had agreed to enter. The second Malcolm stood up, Hensley grabbed his wrist harder than necessary and turned him toward the hood. Malcolm tensed, but did not resist. Spread your feet. Officer, Malcolm said, still measured. What specific crime are you investigating? Keep talking, Hensley muttered. That always helps. Nia opened her door only after being told to do so. She stepped out carefully and closed it behind her. Do not put your hands on my husband unless you can articulate a lawful reason. Hensley laughed under his breath. Oh, so you're both lawyers now. Nia looked at him directly. No, we're much worse for you than that. He didn't understand the sentence yet, but something in her face bothered him. It wasn't fear. It wasn't panic. It wasn't the look he expected from people he intended to intimidate. It was assessment, as if she had already placed him in a category and was mentally documenting the rest. The second unit arrived less than 2 minutes later. Officer Reed Parker, younger, less rigid, stepped out of the cruiser and immediately sensed the tension. He glanced at Malcolm against the hood, at Nia standing with her hands visible, at Hensley's posture, and then at the untouched interior of the car with the dome lights still on. Nothing about the scene suggested danger. Everything about Hensley's body language suggested theater. What do we have? Parker asked. Possible obstruction. Potential stolen vehicle, Hensley said. Nia blinked once. Potential stolen vehicle based on what? Hensley ignored her. Parker looked at the plate, then at the vehicle, then at his in-car computer. Plate comes back clean. Hensley's jaw flexed. We'll verify VIN. Go ahead, Nia said. And while you're at it, call your supervisor. That did it. Hensley turned fully toward her now. You don't tell me how to run my stop. No, she said. But I can tell when you're running it badly. Malcolm, still facing the hood, spoke with a calm that somehow made the whole thing feel even sharper. Officer Parker, I'd like to note for the record that your partner has not stated a valid basis for this detention, has falsely implied the vehicle may be stolen without articulable facts, and has physically restrained me absent lawful cause. I suggest you get a supervisor here immediately. Parker frowned. That did not sound like street talk. That sounded like someone used to building records. Hensley stepped closer. What are you, some kind of jailhouse attorney? Malcolm slowly turned his head just enough to look at him from the corner of his eye. Special Agent Malcolm Brooks. Then Nia reached into her blazer pocket with deliberate slowness and produced a leather credential case. She didn't snap it open dramatically. She just held it at chest level. Special Agent Nia Brooks, she said. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Off duty. Parker's face changed first. Recognition. Alarm. Calculation. Hensley stared at the credentials, then at Nia, then at Malcolm, as if maybe the universe would rearrange itself if he looked hard enough. No, he said. Nia's voice was quiet. Anybody can flash a badge, he said. Malcolm closed his eyes for one brief second, not in fear, but in disappointment. You really want to do this? Parker stepped closer to Hensley and lowered his voice. Dan, I think we need the sergeant. I know procedure, Hensley snapped. Nia answered that before Parker could. Clearly you don't. She opened the credential case wider so the light hit every detail. Agency seal, identification photo, serial number, embedded holographic markings. Real enough that a professional should have known instantly. Hensley did know instantly. That was the problem. Now he was trapped between reality and his own earlier behavior. Dispatch can verify us in 2 minutes, Nia said. Or your sergeant can arrive and verify us in person. But what happens next is already happening. Those are dangerous words when spoken calmly, because they usually mean the person saying them understands systems better than the person hearing them. Parker took a step away and keyed his radio. Hensley shot him a look. Stand down. Parker hesitated. Then he made a decision that probably saved his own career. Negative. I'm requesting sergeant on scene. That's the moment everything truly changed. Up until then, Hensley still believed he might be able to talk his way around this, bully his way through it, or frame it as a misunderstanding with uncooperative people. But once another officer started acting like a witness instead of a wingman, the stop stopped belonging to him. Sergeant Elena Ruiz arrived 7 minutes later. Mid-40s, 20 years on the job, no patience for theatrics. She stepped out, took one look at the scene, and her expression hardened in the precise way it does when an experienced supervisor realizes she is walking into somebody else's preventable disaster. Everyone relax, she said. Nobody talks over each other. Officer Parker, brief me. Hensley cut in immediately. I initiated a lawful stop on suspicious behavior. Ruiz held up a hand without looking at him. I said Parker. That told Nia almost everything she needed to know. Parker explained what he had observed, carefully and factually. No embellishment. No guesses. Clean timeline. When he mentioned that the vehicle had returned clear and that no traffic violation had yet been articulated, Ruiz's face went still. Then she turned to Nia. Ma'am, your credentials? Nia handed them over. Ruiz examined them for 3 seconds, then 4, then looked at Malcolm. And yours? Malcolm handed his over too. Ruiz inhaled once through her nose, very slowly, then closed both credential cases and gave them back with professional respect. Special Agents Brooks. I apologize for this stop and how it has been handled so far. Hensley shifted. Sergeant, with all due respect. Ruiz turned on him so fast the sentence died in his throat. Do not finish that. The body camera later would capture everything. The silence. The posture changes. The moment Hensley realized he was no longer the lead actor in his own version of events. The moment the scene started writing itself against him. Nia didn't gloat. That's important. People love revenge in stories, but in real life, the coldest thing a competent person can do is stay professional while someone else unravels. Sergeant Ruiz, before we go any further, I want it documented that your officer detained my husband without stated probable cause, refused to identify a clear lawful basis for the stop, implied vehicle theft absent articulable facts, and escalated the encounter after a simple request for the reason we were pulled over. Ruiz nodded once. Understood. Malcolm added. I also want it noted that the tone and sequence of escalation strongly suggest bias-based enforcement. Hensley immediately flared up. That's ridiculous. Ruiz cut him off again. You are done talking. That line hit harder than any shouting could have. Now imagine being him in that moment. Not feeling remorse yet, not really. Men like Hensley don't usually get there first. First comes disbelief, then anger, then self-protection. Only later, if ever, comes shame. He had started the night thinking he was about to assert control over 2 civilians he assumed would fold. Instead, he was standing under a street lamp being silenced by his supervisor in front of the very people he had tried to humiliate. Ruiz asked Nia and Malcolm if they were willing to provide immediate statements at the scene or preferred to do so formally later. Nia answered without hesitation. Both. That answer told Ruiz she was dealing with professionals who understood process and intended to use it fully. What happened next was the part Hensley never saw coming. Malcolm asked, very politely, for all responding officers' names, badge numbers, and body camera preservation confirmation. Nia requested the CAD log, dispatch audio, unit GPS data, and any in-car footage associated with the stop. She also asked whether the department had early warning indicators tied to prior complaints. None of that was emotional. None of it sounded dramatic. But every sentence was a hammer landing exactly where it needed to. Hensley tried one last move. If they were agents, why didn't they say that immediately? Nia looked at him with the kind of expression a surgeon might give a man explaining anatomy incorrectly. Because our rights do not depend on our professions. There it was. The line that would later be quoted online, clipped into commentary videos, and repeated by legal analysts for weeks. Because she was right, and everyone there knew it. The issue was never that he had stopped 2 federal agents. The issue was that he believed, before knowing who they were, he could violate 2 ordinary black citizens and likely get away with it. That truth is what made the story spread. The stop ended without arrests, citations, or any legally defensible explanation for the initial detention. Total time on scene, 26 minutes. 26 minutes that would dismantle the reputation Hensley had spent over a decade building for himself. Not because 2 FBI agents were offended. Because everything he did on camera exposed what he believed he could do to people he saw as powerless. Most people, after a night like that, go home shaking. Some vent to family. Some try to forget it. Some convince themselves it could have gone worse and leave it there. Nia and Malcolm did not. They got home just before 10. Nia changed out of her blouse, tied her hair back, and sat at the dining table with her laptop open. Malcolm placed 2 glasses of water down, then opened his own. They didn't speak much for the first few minutes, because both of them understood the same thing at the same time. This wasn't just personal. It was evidentiary. Malcolm typed out the timeline from memory while it was still fresh, marking every minute, every command, every shift in tone. Nia outlined the constitutional issues, procedural violations, and possible departmental policy breaches. She identified the inflection point where a simple request for the reason for the stop triggered retaliatory escalation. Malcolm described the physical contact, Hensley's unsupported mention of possible vehicle theft, the arrival of the second unit, and the exact words used after credentials were shown. Then they compared notes. Refined language. Removed anything speculative. Preserved only what could be supported by footage, logs, and witnesses. By midnight, what they had assembled was not an angry complaint. It was a devastatingly clean record. Professional. Specific. Narrow where it needed to be. Broad where the pattern mattered. The complaint landed on the desk of Oak Ridge Internal Affairs by 8:12 the next morning. It was also copied to the chief's office, the city attorney, the Civilian Oversight Board, and the FBI's own Office of Professional Responsibility Liaison, not because Malcolm and Nia wanted federal muscle thrown around, but because they understood that institutions behave differently when they know a file won't disappear quietly. And here's where the story gets even more intense. The department did not treat this like a normal citizen complaint. They couldn't. First, the video preservation request came from people who knew exactly how footage gets mishandled when departments want ambiguity. Second, Parker's presence complicated any attempt to sanitize the facts. Third, Hensley's body camera had recorded more than he realized, including several muttered comments and one especially ugly sentence after he first approached the car and returned briefly toward his cruiser. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't theatrical. It was said under his breath. But the microphone caught enough. By Monday morning, 3 days after the stop, Hensley was placed on administrative leave. That was fast. Extremely fast. In most departments, cases like this move slowly, sometimes deliberately slowly. Reports get routed. People wait. Footage sits. Language softens. But the Brooks complaint was so thorough, and the recorded evidence so immediate, that delay itself would have looked suspicious. Internal Affairs Lieutenant Marcus Vale led the investigation. Former prosecutor's son, meticulous, dry, impossible to charm. He reviewed the footage once alone, then again with Ruiz's statement beside him, then a third time with training staff and legal counsel. On the second viewing, he paused repeatedly, rewinding specific moments. The unsupported escalation. The refusal to articulate cause. The grip on Malcolm's arm. The sarcastic tone toward Nia. The lack of any objective indicator justifying suspicion of theft. The change in Hensley's demeanor once credentials were shown. The body language of a man who knew, in real time, that his authority had outrun his justification. The findings were ugly. First, The traffic stop itself lacked a clearly documented legal basis. Second, Hensley escalated to detention language without articulating reasonable suspicion tied to an actual crime. Third, he initiated unnecessary physical contact without sufficient cause. Fourth, his conduct reflected discourtesy and unprofessionalism inconsistent with department standards. Fifth, the totality of the stop raised serious concerns about bias-based policing. And then there was the additional evidence. The phrase on camera, not a slur screamed into the night, but the kind of muttered, dehumanizing line men think won't matter because they're used to being protected by context, hierarchy, and benefit of the doubt. In some ways, that made it worse. Public hate can be denied, debated, reframed. Casual prejudice caught in an unguarded moment feels truer because it sounds lived in. When the Civilian Oversight Board got access to the preliminary findings, one member reportedly asked the same question a lot of viewers would later ask online. If they weren't federal agents, would anything have happened here at all? That question became gasoline. Because that was the core of it, wasn't it? The title grabs you with the FBI twist, but the deeper wound in the story is simpler and much more painful. He thought he had found people he could disrespect safely, people he could push around, people whose calm questions would be treated like insolence instead of citizenship. The badge reveal didn't create the wrongdoing. It only exposed it. 2 weeks later, the department released a brief public statement announcing that Officer Daniel Hensley had been suspended pending final disciplinary determination following an internal investigation into a traffic stop involving serious deviations from policy, professionalism, and constitutional policing standards. That phrasing was careful, but everyone knew more was coming. The public didn't know the names of the stopped couple yet. Nia and Malcolm had not gone public, but rumors spread internally, then regionally. Somebody leaked that the civilians were federal agents. Another person leaked that the stop involved racial bias allegations. Then a local journalist filed an open records request for the footage. The department resisted at first, citing an ongoing personnel matter, which only increased suspicion. Once the leak hit a larger metro news outlet, the pressure changed. Civil rights groups demanded release. Local clergy demanded release. A former judge on a radio segment said that if the department had confidence in its own process, transparency would help, not hurt. Within days, the city caved. The footage went public on a Tuesday afternoon. By Tuesday night, it was everywhere. Clips of Nia standing under the street lamp with her hands visible while calmly dismantling a bad stop spread across every platform. Malcolm's line, "You may want to rethink that sentence," was stitched into commentary channels and reaction videos. Lawyers broke down the constitutional issues. Former cops argued over the training failures. Civil rights advocates focused on the racial dynamics. Body language analysts, of course, turned the whole thing into a frame-by-frame dissection of arrogance collapsing under accountability. And then came the sentence everyone kept replaying. Because our rights do not depend on our professions. That line hit people like truth usually does. Clean. Final. Inescapable. Some viewers praised Nia and Malcolm for staying calm, for documenting everything, for refusing to be baited. Others said what people always say in stories like this. They said the couple should have just complied more. They said revealing federal status earlier would have ended it sooner. They said being right doesn't matter if a roadside encounter turns dangerous. And to be fair, that last part carries a painful truth. Safety is not theoretical. Plenty of people de-escalate not because authority deserves it, but because survival demands it. But that criticism misses the point. They did comply. They kept their hands visible, followed commands, moved slowly, spoke clearly, and asked lawful questions. The problem was never their behavior. The problem was Hensley's decision to interpret dignity as defiance until the moment he learned the people in front of him belonged to a category he had been taught to fear professionally. 3 days after the footage release, Daniel Hensley resigned before the final disciplinary hearing concluded. The department announced it had accepted his resignation in lieu of termination, though internally the language was blunter. He was finished. 11 years on the force, ended by 26 minutes on camera, and a pattern of judgment that finally met a record too precise to bury. The fallout didn't stop there. The city ordered a broader review of discretionary traffic stops conducted by Hensley over the previous 18 months. Training records were audited. Early warning complaint thresholds were revisited. Supervisors were questioned about why prior complaints had not triggered stronger intervention. 2 additional citizens came forward with stories describing Hensley's stops as aggressive, demeaning, and oddly selective. Neither prior complaint had led to meaningful discipline. Suddenly, the department wasn't just facing one bad night. It was facing the possibility that one bad night had only become visible because this time the targets had the expertise, composure, and credibility to force the issue into daylight. Oak Ridge announced several policy changes over the next month. Officers were required to articulate the basis for stops earlier in encounters absent immediate safety threats. Additional bias recognition training became mandatory. Supervisors had to respond in person to escalated compliance disputes whenever feasible. Body camera activation and retention rules were tightened. And in private, more than one officer admitted the same uncomfortable reality. They had just watched a couple off-duty handle procedural law more cleanly on the roadside than some officers handled it after years in uniform. Nia and Malcolm stayed mostly out of the spotlight, at least at first. They declined major interviews. They did not monetize the moment. They did not launch a media tour. That silence frustrated some people who wanted a public showdown. But it made sense. They were not activists by profession. They were professionals who had been mistreated and then chose to respond with discipline instead of spectacle. Eventually, Malcolm spoke at a closed training seminar on procedural conduct and escalation psychology. Nia later joined a panel on constitutional policing and public trust. Neither used the platform to humiliate individual officers broadly. They talked about systems, habits, assumptions, and the danger of unexamined bias combined with discretionary power. In other words, they spoke like people who understood the stakes were bigger than one disgraced cop. And that's the part of this story that matters most. Because this isn't just about a racist officer embarrassing himself in front of 2 people who turned out to outrank his assumptions. It's about what prejudice looks like when it wears procedure like a costume. It's about how often ordinary citizens are expected to absorb suspicion, attitude, and intrusion without protest, then get blamed for any tension that follows. It's about how many stories never become headlines because the people inside them don't have federal credentials, legal training, immaculate composure, or footage strong enough to survive institutional spin. Think about the power dynamic for a second. On that road, before the reveal, Hensley believed he had all of it. Badge, weapon, roadside control, narrative advantage. He assumed the couple had only 2 choices: submit quietly or give him an excuse. That assumption is the real villain here. Not just racism in the abstract, but the operational confidence that some people can be pushed because the system will probably take your side later. Then reality interrupted him. And reality came wearing a calm voice, a leather credential case, and a sentence that stripped the entire encounter to its moral core. Our rights do not depend on our professions. That's why the story spread. Not because people were impressed the FBI got involved. They were already involved. The story spread because millions of people instantly understood the alternate version of that night. The version where Malcolm and Nia are not federal agents. The version where the complaint is dismissed. The version where the body camera somehow malfunctions at the wrong moment. The version where the couple goes home angry and humiliated and tells themselves they're lucky it wasn't worse. People recognize that ghost story because too many have lived some version of it. So what should anyone watching take from this? First, authority without accountability becomes performance, and performance with a weapon is dangerous. Second, calm is not weakness. Sometimes calm is the sharpest form of resistance a person has. Third, knowing your rights matters. Even though knowing them doesn't always protect you in the moment, it can still shape what happens after. Fourth, documentation changes outcomes. Precise memory, preserved footage, and disciplined reporting can do what outrage alone often cannot. Fifth, professionalism is not something you owe only upward to institutions. It's something institutions owe downward to the public too. And finally, a uniform is not proof of character. It is proof of employment. Character is what shows up when someone is questioned, challenged, or denied the obedience they expected. If you were in Nia and Malcolm's position, would you have revealed your credentials immediately? Would you have stayed as calm? Would you have filed the complaint? Or would you have tried to move on? There are no easy answers to those questions, because roadside fear is real, and every person calculates risk differently. But what their story shows, even as fiction grounded in emotional truth, is that dignity under pressure can expose ugliness faster than rage ever will. In the end, Daniel Hensley lost more than a job. He lost the illusion that he could decide who deserved the full protection of the law and who could be treated like a problem first and a citizen second. Malcolm and Nia, meanwhile, returned to their lives carrying one more story they never should have had to earn. Not a story about triumph exactly. Something more complicated than that. A story about composure. About restraint. About how exhausting it is to be prepared for disrespect even on a drive home from dinner. And about what happens when the people you thought were powerless themselves and refuse to be reduced. This story matters because it's not just about one black couple and one failed cop. It's about every driver who has felt their chest tighten at flashing lights for reasons that have nothing to do with guilt. It's about every citizen who has been spoken to like a suspect first and a human being second. It's about every institution that says trust us while too often protecting the wrong people until a camera makes denial impossible. And maybe most of all, it's about the lesson Hensley learned too late. The people in front of you are not small just because you decided to see them that way. Sometimes the couple you think you can intimidate is smarter, steadier, and stronger than your prejudice allowed you to imagine. Sometimes the story you expected to control ends with your own voice on camera, your own conduct under review, and your own career collapsing under the weight of what you chose to do when you thought nobody important was watching. But everybody was watching. They just hadn't seen it yet. And that is the story of how a racist cop pulled over a black couple, only to realize he had just detained the FBI. More than that, it's a story about what happens when bias meets evidence, when intimidation meets composure, and when the people you underestimated refuse to surrender either their rights or their dignity.